Okay, so a big hello to everybody watching this recording. My name's Kylie Kerr and I'm an early career researcher at ACU. And I have the honour of interviewing the philosopher and longtime PESA member, Professor John Ozolins. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Okay, so
Glad to be here.
Brilliant. Let's go into our first question. What drew you into philosophy?
Well, I think it's been a lifelong love of philosophy for me. I was thinking about where it all started, and I remember when I was a kid, a Bible story about Solomon and the two women who came saying each was the mother of a child. And Solomon came up with a solution, a very clever solution. And what he did was basically say, well, I'll cut the child in half, so you can each have half. But of course, if they cut the child in half, it'll be dead. So the real mother calls out, give it to her, because she was the real mother. The other one said, oh, no, that sounds like a good idea. So we knew who the real mother was. And that struck me as a very astute observation, about human beings. And after that, I always thought, yeah, I wouldn't mind being clever enough to think of things like that. And so I developed the love of wisdom. And I was always a curious kid. And so things of knowing the why of things, or why do we have to do it? Why do they do it this way, and so on. And that sort of stayed with me, and wanting to know why we do things the same way all the time, or why do people believe this or that, or so it starts off with a kind of concern for the natural world to some extent, why is the sky blue type questions, but wanting to know the answers. And you start off, for instance, the stars, and understanding something about the planets and the motion of the stars and why they're there and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of continued on. In my teens, I was probably very foolishly trying to read some philosophy books. I remember reading Spinoza and Leibniz and Kant. I read Kant at about 16, the Critique of Pure Reason. Understood zero probably of all of those books, but it kind of awakened me a love of philosophical questions. So probably from an early age. And then I got into philosophy after I'd done a science degree, and I did a master's in philosophy of maths, and then went on to do philosophy of education. So yeah, it's interesting. In some ways it was there is a common path. I mean, Michael Peters, I think, also did philosophy of science, and Michael Matthews did philosophy of science. So it's interesting that a number of us who are in the society from an early time sort of came into it through philosophy of science. So anyway, but that's how I ended up in philosophy. This kind of constant desire to ask questions, and why do we assume this, and why do we assume, sometimes to my own detriment, I must say, because sometimes you need to accept assumptions if you're working in maths and not keep asking why. It creates problems for you. So yeah, that was really, it's a lifelong love of philosophy, I guess, the questioning. It continues to this day.
Incredible. And reading Kant at 16, that's amazing.
Yeah, well, I don't know about amazing. Pretty stupid, really, when I think back on it now. I do know I understood virtually nothing of Kant at all. But I did read it. I ploughed through it, reading it,
Wow.
page after page, and I think, despite the fact that I understood nothing, I still kept reading.
Sparked an interest.
Well, stupidity, I'd put it down to, really. Anyway, I did learn later a bit more about Kant when I went back at a much more mature age to reread this and actually teach Kant's critique of pure reason. Even then, I found it very hard to understand. So I wasn't that stupid when I was 16. It was still really hard.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Well, that leads nicely into my next question. What are your hopes for the future of philosophy?
Well, I think philosophy's it's something of a crossroad. I feel it's become very self-absorbed. I mean, it's become a kind of, I don't know, you might want to call it a kind of technical discipline that only talks to other practitioners, and it seems to have developed a taste for obscurantism. I mean, all the great philosophers, Kant may be accepted, are really much more clear. The best philosophers are usually really clear in what they're talking about, whereas our tendency in a lot of stuff that I read today is to be really self-absorbed and obscurantist. I mean, it's full of jargon. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think I'd like to see is a return to a much stronger commitment to truth. I mean, philosophy is the search for wisdom, and wisdom is connected to the idea of truth. Well, we've seemed to have lost that. I mean, most of the modern stuff that I've read treats truth in a very cavalier fashion, and in a sense, as a kind of optional extra, or not even an optional extra. It's just irrelevant to what philosophy's doing, and we get what I feel is a return to what Plato called sophism. I want to be able to produce persuasive arguments. It doesn't matter whether they're any good or not, or whether they're about the truth. They're just, arguments about how I feel, and there's a kind of destructiveness about that. I mean, I think some of the prime examples of this is in the very modern, most recent stuff is sort of the work of, say, Judith Butler, which is self-contradictory in so many kinds of ways and is really shoddy in lots of ways. You want to read Martha Nussbaum's criticisms of Judith Butler. I mean, mine are mild in comparison to what Martha Nussbaum says, but she's right, Nussbaum, in many ways, in that we've gone to this idea that truth doesn't matter, that we're not looking for truth, we're just looking to build a particular kind of theoretical program, which is showcasing our particular views, and it doesn't much matter whether they're connected with anything that's true or not. They're just got to be persuasive. And let's face it, Judith Butler is a clever woman, far cleverer than I am, and her system has appealed to many people. But the fact remains that once you dig deep, as I have done, some people just tried to dissuade me of this foolish course, but nevertheless I did decide to have a look at what she had to say, and it is self-contradictory in many respects. Anyway, that's another story. So that's the second thing. And the third thing that I think, and this comes back to the point about obscurantism, the third point is about being able to actually talk to ordinary people. Philosophy doesn't actually address real problems anymore. I try to do this with my students. For instance, and this might be slightly controversial, I was teaching a class on being, heavy-duty metaphysics. It was a more advanced class. This is just recently. So the question is about being and essences. So what do we mean by essence? So being and essence are connected, because we talk about things that exist have connections to substances. So what are substances? Well, substances have an essence, and so they have an essential kind of a set of attributes which enable us to distinguish what it is. So I said to them, okay, that's all very good. Now, what about this very simple question? What is a woman? All right, this seems to be a very difficult question these days. You ask a politician, what is a woman? and they can't tell you what a woman is. Now,
Mm.
most ordinary people will tell you what a woman is. It's not very difficult. Okay, why is that? Ordinary people somehow got more insight than philosophers, or what's the story here? Well, this is what I mean, the connection between ordinary kinds of questions and philosophical questions. So can we answer that question? Well, I think we can. But, and you can use this big, sort of apparatus of heavy duty metaphysics to sort of come up with an answer to the question. But ordinary people are able to answer it reasonably easily. So why is it that politicians can't? And the answer might lie in sort of ideological commitments of various kinds. And what are philosophers saying about any of this? Have you heard of any philosophers saying much about this? Or no. What did they say about COVID and lockdowns and things of that kind of? I did write a few things, I must admit, but of course they would have gone to audiences of people that didn't read, the ordinary press, probably. Well, with certainty, unlikely. But we see very little, and I'm probably guilty of this as much as any other philosopher. We don't say anything in the public square about questions that are facing ordinary people, which are existential questions, about the nature of what it is to live and so on, and what life is about. We're rather silent on those essential questions. So that, to me, is what I hope we can do a little bit better. And the fourth thing, which I think is a big problem in our world today, is the lack of a connection between philosophy and theology. You might say, well, I'm harking back to the good old Middle Ages, where, religion and philosophy were bound together. Well, it's a bit more than just saying we've got to be religious. It isn't so much that. It's the science of theology itself. I mean, if you want to talk about it's kind of a natural metaphysics, but the point is really that. And here I think John Paul II was right about philosophy and theology are the two wings of a dove, if you like, and you can't fly without one without the other. And I've noticed in a lot of philosophy, we get to a point where you need to talk about something that's transcendent, and we're not good at it anymore. We balk at that. But it seems to me if we embrace the idea of the transcendent, we're going to be a lot better off. Now, that doesn't necessarily, because I think it completes philosophy. And you think about people like Levinas, for example, a very strong sense of the transcendent, I mean, in his work. But he doesn't push it as a religious person, as a Jewish person. He puts it out there as a connection between philosophy and what is outside philosophy. We're setting our boundaries too narrowly, I think, and I think we need to re-explore that, which can appeal both to people of faith, it seems to me, but also people who are agnostics or even atheists. I mean, it doesn't preclude a sense of that importance of transcendence, and that seems to be takes philosophy a little bit further. So that, if you like, those are the kinds of things I would hope for philosophy, a return to that, to those sorts of things that I think will make philosophy much more relevant to the world. And I mean, relevance is a tenuous kind of thing, but what I mean really it returns philosophy to the core, I think, of our endeavours to understand something about ourselves and the world we live in. And I think that's what philosophy is about. It's that constant questioning, a constant trying to see things in that broader context of how the world is and how it ought to be. Anyway, that's a long-winded way.
That's fascinating. And you've actually answered my next question, which was, what have we lost and what do we need to focus on more? You've very much covered that, but is there anything else you would like to add? What have we lost in philosophy?
Yeah, well, I think we need to, again, as I've said, those couple of things. The other thing is to also avoid faddism. And by faddism, I mean, we tend to jump on bandwagons. We sort of, you think of what comes out of the States, and some of it's very uncritical, and we slavishly copy whatever's coming out of the States. For instance, I mean, okay, it's the biggest Anglo-Saxon sort of philosophical world, I guess, and they've got lots of journals, lots of publications, and all of that kind of stuff. So, of course, even though some of their philosophers might be mediocre, the fact that they publish all this stuff, we tend to sort of think, oh, well, it's coming out of America, it's the latest and all of that. I think and this is something I learnt about how parochial our own world here in Australia is, our concerns with certain sorts of questions philosophically. But there's a much wider world out there, and I learnt this through my kind of exposure to a whole variety of different kinds of cultures and different philosophical ways of thinking in Africa, in Middle East, in India, in China, and in Europe, and so on, which are totally different in many respects to kinds of questions that are focused in America. For example, currently we have all this stuff on, identity theory is one thing, and the identity politics and how evil and bad white people are, and the need, and we're seeing this in Australia too, this kind of slavish copying that. I mean, the term First Nations, for example, what's a nation? What do you mean by a nation? Nation is a very modern term. How can there have been First Nations? Are you telling me that the term nations applied to the organisation of Aboriginal society prior to the 19th century, which is when really nations became a word that was associated with certain kinds of political organisation? Well, the answer is no, it wasn't. If you understand anything or read anything about Aboriginal culture, they were never nations, never nations. I did spend some time doing some research in this kind of area, and the idea of nations. But Aboriginal culture is something, I think. This is an interpretation, and where's it come from? It hasn't arisen out of Australian thinking. It's arisen out of something that was in America. Why? So we're copying certain sorts of things, and it seems to me one of the things we have to avoid as philosophers is this kind of faddism. That we adopt this stuff. The second thing is jargon. I mean, do you read any papers? And I do a bit of reviewing, and they're just chock full of jargon. And why is it? It's one of the things I mentioned was obscurantism. It's why are we using words that actually confuse, words that actually obscure what we're trying to say? Is it because we're saying something so banal that it's only by dressing it up in lots of big words it'll sound impressive? And why do we want to sound impressive? Let's try and be plain about what we say. What's wrong with plain English? George Orwell makes this point beautifully in an essay on speaking English. And why does what's his main point? He says, because once we start to get into this world of obscurantism and jargon, we're actually trying to obfuscate ideas, and we're then prone to being sold all kinds of things that because we don't understand what's being said, we just nod our heads and accept it as if it must be right. So we play into the hands of ideologues and people who really, once you challenge them on what they might mean is either completely nonsensical, or it's self-contradictory, or it's not saying anything at all. But if you dress things up in this sort of language, you puff it up and make it sound like it's something really profound and deep, and often and 99% of the time it's not. So to me, those are the important things. And one more thing is a reliance on authorities. This was an old problem, the argumentum ad verecundiam, the idea of appealing to authorities. Why do I say what I just said? Well, of course, Plato said this, and Aristotle, and of course, Jones and Bloggs and 500 other people. So I must be right. It must be true because all these people have said this. I notice this a lot. That people rely on authorities. They quote, 6 authors who have said something similar to what they've said. Now, if you go to the trouble of checking things, for instance, you find that sometimes these are misquotes. Sometimes when you're quoting, say, Aristotle reliably says X, and you're quoting a secondary source, if you don't check the primary source, you're getting somebody else's interpretation, and often that interpretation is wrong. And so here it's about relying on authorities and the weight of. I mean, if one person gets it wrong and 6 people quote that one person, and the next 6 quote those other 6, you've got a completely erroneous kind of understanding of something. And so this reliance on authority, I think, is another thing that I think we need to avoid in philosophy. I've probably used up all my time now.
I think we are almost out of time, so we'll just I have so many questions, but just in the interest of time, we'll move on to, is there something you're looking forward to discussing further at the PESA conference?
Yeah, I think one of the things that PESA conferences have been noted for has been that people do listen to each other, and they're very supportive. And so there's a kind of optimism which I think is kind of missing in our society at the moment. We seem to languish and sort of wallow in a whole lot of self-pity. Everything is bad, for instance, one of the big questions that we currently are on about is climate change, and there's a lot of hand-wringing about this and how terrible it is. Now, it struck me that we've never had one story which has said, well, actually, climate change might be quite good for us in some respects. For instance, we've had some very wet years lately. Now they're all putting it down to El Nino, and again the hand-wringing is, well, isn't this terrible? There are floods and things. Well, the alternative is we get dried out and we have bushfires. So, is there any good thing to be said about the fact that our aquifers are all probably getting well and truly replenished by all this rain, that certain kinds of climate changes are making parts of Australia more fertile than they were before, and so on? I mean, is climate change the terrible thing that keeps being painted? And again, are there positives we can take out of all this? So that, to me, is optimism, is something that I'd like to see a bit more. So I'm only using climate change as one example of this. The other thing is to think about the nature of, if we're talking about philosophy of education, well, what kind of education do we want for our children? I mean, do we want a world where there is unity, or do we want a world where there's more divisiveness? It seems like we're currently in a model where there's a lot of finger pointing and this, well, look how badly you've treated us all, and we now have SBS has got a series on the Australian wars. Now, again, this is a misuse of the term war. What is a war? How do we define war? A war is between states. If there were no Aboriginal states, and there weren't, They weren't countries. There was no war declared. War has to be declared. Look at Putin. He hasn't declared a war. It's a special military operation. Why is that? Because a war is something totally different. War requires a certain set of conditions. Okay, now you avoid declaring war because it puts you in a different space entirely. So here again, we need to pay attention to how people, slip kinds of words, and we need to pull them up on that, but we don't. But we've got to be positive, it seems to me, not positively pull them up, but try to look also on the positive aspects of the world and life, and look for the things that celebrate life and celebrate our unity rather than celebrate what's divisive. So, if I accuse you of fat shaming me or ageist shaming me, I mean, that immediately creates a barrier. Now, it's true, we've got to be careful how we treat each other, but there's a kind of accusatory kind of thing, and what's missing is an inability to forgive. To me, that's a crucial thing. We must be able to forgive each other. Now, I know that sounds very Christian of me, but in practical terms, it's how we manage to live together. I mean, we can't live together. I mean, inevitably, somebody will rub us up the wrong way. Okay, it happens all the time. So either we forgive them, or we allow that resentment to fester in us, and we become miserable creatures, and we lash out at people, and I mean, the whole cycle just grows, and the only way to stop the cycle is to sort of say, well, I'm not going to act that way. And I mean, if we're going to talk about our one use of free will, that might be it. We'll just say, well, I'm not going to do that. How hard, I'm not saying it's easy to do, but at least you can say, well, I'm not going to do that. Damn it all. I'm going to just say, walk away from that and say, well, I'll forgive. So that's another thing. So I think one of the things about PESA is that we've always been very supportive of each other, and we do have our stoushes, but they're stoushes that we forgive with, and we accept that there are these ideological differences, and yet we're still able to continue to kind of listen to each other. And to me, that's one thing we've lost a little in our society more broadly, that people, if you're not hearing what you want to hear, then I'm not talking to you. You're to be avoided and shunned and cancelled. And to me, we need to speak out against that and say, well, no, that's not how a society should work. And I think that's one of the things we might have, at least be a model for that. I mean, we're not going to change everybody's opinion overnight, but I think we need to keep plugging away at that.
Okay, so, well, on that note of positivity and optimism, and let's end there. Thank you very, very much, John Ozolins, for your insights, and we look forward to seeing you at the conference.
Well, you will only by Zoom, unfortunately, but I'll be